one had to describe the Ukrainian Sixties through one personality, Horska would be the perfect candidate. Her practices and her life decisions embody the spirit of this cultural epoch, with all its contradictions and dualities. Her violent death in 1970, as she is believed to have been assassinated by the KGB, symbolically and tragically marked the end of hopeful times of Vidliga. Horska was brought up in a family of Soviet establishment. The explicit pro-Ukrainian views she took in her mature years and her fearless political activism were quite radical, not only in view of her training as a Soviet artist informed by the social realist canon and propaganda themes, but also among her close artist friends, since many of them were avoiding political talks even at private gatherings. But Horska can in no way be called an underground artist. On the contrary, she was extremely active in taking government commissions and participating in state-organized group shows. Here we need to remind ourselves that there was essentially no other kind of public exhibitions in the USSR. Nevertheless, she tried to hack the system and make use of its advantages. As we know from our previous chapter, in 1963, she co-founded the Club for Creative Youth, or Suchasnik, supervised by the Komsomol, a Soviet youth organization. But she soon became bitterly disappointed with the whole enterprise, which turned out to be nothing but a comfortable bubble of controlled creative freedom. Horska's professional practice covered painting, graphics, and theater production, though most of her designs and props were censored and never saw the stage. But perhaps her main area of work was monumental art. Together with her husband, Viktor Zaretsky, she was one of the most in-demand mosaic makers, invited to make original artworks not only in Kyiv, but also in the most industrially advanced and rich cities of Donetsk and Mariupol, among other places. Let us start our conversation about Horska's monumental art legacy with the same image that opened up the first part of the lecture. This is a sketch, a sort of a collage made of different materials such as paper, cardboard, and fabric of various textures. It was initially created as a study for the future monumental mosaic panel designed and produced by the team of artists, including Alla Horska, Viktor Zaretsky, and Boris Plaksy and Anatoly Lymarev. We can assume that it was one of the final small-scale versions that artists were supposed to demonstrate to the committee to get the official approval before proceeding to actual production of a large-scale version on the wall. And this is what the final work looked like. On the next slide, we can also see an archival image made with a group of children contemplating on the piece, trying to understand the scale of work. If we compare the photo of the final piece and the sketch, we can actually understand much more about this sort of double-layered practice of the 60s artists who worked with monumental art. As we can see, the sketch demonstrates quite an experimental vision of playing around with colors and composition elements. But even the final version, made in smolto and stones, can be interpreted in a number of ways. On a basic level, it tells a typical propaganda-like story of the heroic sacrifice of Soviet guerrilla fighters, known as Young Guard in the Soviet Apocrypha. Shiny stones are assembled to produce a supernatural effect. Soviet youngsters are illuminated through golden shape, much like biblical characters in old Byzantine mosaics. They look unreal, the saints of the Soviet pantheon. There is an alternative title for the work, Relay Race, and it gives an extended interpretation of a plot. A girl and a young man are seen not as guards of the war years, but as their descendants. It is none other than the 60s generation that we see here. Brought up on similar heroic stories, soaked in Soviet patriotic spirit, they were expected to pick up the victory flag from their father figures and rebuild the ruined country on construction sites, but also on the cultural front. Horska was the perfect embodiment of this stratum, the daughter of the top-ranking manager in Soviet cinema herself, which was a generously funded industry responsible for bringing myth like the one of the Young Guard to millions of viewers. She was supposed to bring those myths into the trendy contemporary medium of the mosaics murals. But in the end, it is not Horska's background, but her life choices that give us perhaps the most truthful explanation of the plot. the young guards of the dissident movement striving to overcome the Soviet legacy of lies and propaganda. The total red flag is not actually raised above their heads, but is likely to be left behind. Sometimes it takes destruction for something to be remembered. History teaches us this. It also demonstrates that someone often becomes the first martyr before becoming a hero in the eyes of the next generations. Art history is no exception. The devastating fate of a masterpiece of monumental art, a half-destroyed mosaic depicting what used to be a huge bird fighting the wind, mirrors the tragic life of its creator, Ukrainian artist and political activist Alla Horska. In July 2022, news and social media spread a horrible image of colorful leftovers of what used to be a mosaic panel, reflecting the bright southern sun of Mariupol, an industrial city on the coast of the Sea of Azov, that was heavily bombed in the previous months and is currently occupied by Russian troops. The title of this 1967 mural speaks for itself, Kestrel, or Boreviter in Ukrainian. It can be translated as the one who fights the wind. The work is also known as the Bird of Hellas, in allusion to the town's Greek origins. And Horska, metaphorically speaking, was indeed the one who was fighting the wind. Another example of the strategy of combining official commissions in monumental art together with the non-Soviet artistic and philosophical ideas was the practice of Valery Lamach, one of the intellectuals and, I dare to say, spiritual leaders, not in a religious way though, of the Kyiv artistic circles of the 60s, 80s. Here we can see his young portrait together with his wife, artist Alina Lakh, and I will talk more about her own practice a bit later. When I mention Kyiv artistic circles, I don't mean a big community of many people. Of course, everyone knew one another, and this offline era brought joy of regular parties and get-togethers that were a usual thing. But the serious conversations and what we can describe as an artistic exchange of uncensored ideas were happening behind closed doors. Art historian Boris Lobanovsky describes these intimate communities as Kyiv anachorets, or Kyiv monks. And indeed, certain artworks, books, music records, or oral knowledge were hidden behind closed doors of the solitary studios and were distributed among up to 10 pairs of ears and eyes, not more. A key example of such secret knowledge was the Book of Schemes, a multi-volume theoretical opus magnum Lamach was working on in the late 60s and during 70s. During his lifetime, it existed as a manuscript only. Only in recent years, it was first published as a PDF and later released as a paper book in a very small number of copies. The book can be loosely described as the artist's original attempt to structure and explain the world history of arts and cultures from ancient times till the 20th century, through certain patterns and concepts, which he visually illustrated with drawings and charters, the schemes. Here we can see several examples of the schemes. And this is an example of how Valery Lamach, a highly demanded monumental artist, found a way to implement his experimental findings into the official public art commissions. This is an element from a large complex in Kamyansk, formerly known as Dniprodzerzhinsk, another industrial center in the southern east of Ukraine. This is yet another important piece, a series of large-scale mosaic murals on Borosteysky Avenue in Kyiv. It was envisioned in the 60s as a solid complex of 6 pieces united by a narrative concept. But the architects of the whole area changed the construction plans at the last moment and added a shopping area in front of the residential buildings, which dramatically changed the angle of view on the mosaic and made it possible to view them only from a distance, from the other side of the highway. The artists had almost completed only 2 mosaics out of 6 and refused to finish the commission because they found that the original idea was violated. Only in about 10 years, the city of Kyiv addressed the artistic brigade, without late Lamach, unfortunately, to complete this project because the city was getting itself ready to host events of the Moscow Olympics. Without Lamach, the rest of the team decided to create something completely different, both stylistically and conceptually. and to leave Lammach's part untouched as a symbolic gesture of honoring his legacy. Curators of Documenta 14, where a selection of original drawings of schemes were first exhibited internationally, gave them the following description, I quote, "These books construct a cosmological mythology developed by the artist over more than 30 years. He first started compiling them in the early 40s when he was sent to Germany as a forced laborer. In the grand cosmic picture deployed in the 5 books, the word scheme is elevated to function as a lens of fundamental knowledge based on light, in Lammach's own words. The scheme is a constellation of nodes breathing light. They approach each other infinitely. They glow and they fade, expressing the inexpressibility of the world." Among all the manifolds of the 60s undiscovered treasures, this opus magnum remains one of the most enigmatic and under-researched due to its complexity and unprecedented nature. But even its very existence became possible as a result of more than 20 years of compiling, deciphering, retyping and editing by Alina Lakh, an artist and the lifelong partner of Valery Lammach, his closest peer, the only person capable of dealing with piles of handwritten and drawn papers left after his untimely death in 1978. Later on, art historian and Alina's friend Lyudmila Lysenko joined her in these efforts and basically financed the paper publication of first 100 copies. Alina's own life story cannot be described as a dramatic one, but rather quite typical and even illustrative on how female artists' careers were meant to be shaped by the state system of arts promotion. And here we talk not only about limitations and threats the Soviet system was infamous for, but rather merits and comforts it proposed in exchange for allocating a particular predefinite place in the art industry instead of fostering artists to seek their own independent way of self-expression. Alina Lakh wanted to be a painter. Immediately after the Second World War, she failed to enter Kyiv Art Institute because of bureaucracy and nepotism, and ended up in the Lviv Institute for Applied and Decorative Arts, where she studied tapestry. This path naturally brought her to a career of a designer of mass-produced fabrics. She moved to Kyiv and started working at Darnica textile factory until her retirement in 1981. After work, she had a few private hours in her studio for personal practice. After retirement, she completely devoted herself to saving an unprecedented piece of art, theory and philosophy from vanishing, the Book of Schemes by Valery Lammach. Alina Lammach's tapestries, mostly with floral patterns, can give us quite a simplistic first impression. But if we imagine that she was working over these pieces for years, and this is a very delicate, scrupulous and demanding work by itself, alongside deciphering and, in fact, co-authored the Book of Schemes, we can and must look at this work from a completely different angle and see an absolutely new level of depth there. I consider Alina and Valery Lammach's case to be a very important embodiment of the 60s spirit, with all its dualities and almost sacred belief in their artistic mission, despite the lack of public recognition during their lifetime. The last artist I would like to personally introduce today is Grigory Gavrilenko. Perhaps the brightest example of such belief in art as the only truly meaningful practice and in solitude as a tool of reaching this ideal. Gavrilenko was the one fighting the most vigorously against the duality of his art practice and tried to be as uncompromised as possible in choosing what he worked on and how. He was trained as a book graphic artist. During his professional career of around 30 years, unfortunately, much like his closest peer Valery Lammach, he passed away when he was a little more over 60 years old. He made designs and illustrations for around 30 books. There are several that are widely considered to be masterpieces of the so-called Kyiv graphic school, which was truly blooming in the 60s and 70s. Here are a couple of them. One of the main motives of his graphic and painting practice was the female portrait. The image of a female had rather symbolic and abstract meaning for the artist. Much like Dante, whose Vita Nova he illustrated with similar minimalistic and silent images, it seems like Gavrilenko was looking for a certain ideal, or rather an ideal formula of how the symbolic and conditional language of painting can speak about unconditional ideas of beauty and transcendency. One can say that such a repetitive practice of creating these female images was the way of spiritual escapism as well. To Women in Nature, a part of the collection of the National Art Museum of Ukraine, is the only large-scale work and a sort of culmination of this line. This is the only example of mosaics Haverlenko did, but not for the public space. It was, I suppose, more of a formal experiment. These works were featured in his close friend's film, Serhiy Parajanov. It is called Kyiv Frescoes. The film's idea was banned on the first stage of pre-production, and it now exists as a sort of a draft version due to later efforts of Parajanov's friends who rescued the film rolls with sample studies. I highly encourage you to watch this 15-minute masterpiece online. You can even actually watch it on YouTube. This is a very sensitive, surreal and profound portrait of post-war Ukraine, made with a great love to this country and deep understanding of its cultural codes.